Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today is the highly anticipated return of our yearly tight end tier list video. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to go ahead and share statistics and my opinions regarding my top 24 tight ends going into the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, we all know how volatile and inconsistent the tight end position has been over the course of the last couple of years. In fact, last season, in a half PPR scoring format, there were only 4 tight ends that surpassed 150 total fantasy points. In comparison, the kicker position had 9 players surpass 150 fantasy points, and the team defensive position had 5 that surpassed 150 fantasy points. That in itself just gives you a little bit more context as to why I truly always want to have an elite level tight end on my roster who has the potential upside to getting to that 175, 200 point role within my team. Now, of course, besides the elite level tight ends, I'm going to be talking about guys at the lower end. Again, it's a top 24 list for a reason. So for those of you who aren't able to invest in an elite level tight end, would rather go for running backs and wide receivers, you can certainly get away with drafting a later round talent that ends up developing and being a top 12 tight end by the end of the year. Now, before we begin today's video, I want to remind you, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. Of course, with the singular purpose of helping you win a fantasy football championship this year with our videos this offseason in order to help you with your draft, or during the regular season in order to get you ready with your waiver wires, your weekly lineups, and of course, Sunday morning live streams, just to make sure if you have any questions, we're answering those and helping you out. All right, outside of that, the information that sits above my head today will be the final day for those of you who want to sign up using promo code Andrew to have an entry in tomorrow's giveaway. Tomorrow at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I will be live streaming here on this channel. Of course, we'll be doing some drafts via Underdog, all that kind of jazz. I'll be answering as many questions as I possibly can throughout that span of time. But I also will be giving away $500. 10 of you who sign up using promo code Andrew not only will get a first-time deposit match via Underdog Fantasy when you use promo code Andrew, not only will you also get my half and full PPR rankings when you sign up, but you'll also have a chance to win $50 in Underdog cash. So 10 of you will be lucky enough tomorrow. I'll be spinning the wheel with all your usernames on it, so hopefully I'll see you then. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into today's tight end tier list video. Beginning with our S tier, there's only one player that I wanted to talk about. It is Travis Kelce. Now, Travis Kelce was dethroned last season. You know, he had a consecutive stretch of 5 years where he was the #1 overall fantasy tight end from 2016 through 2020. Now, obviously, Mark Andrews was able to dethrone him, but even with that, I still think Travis Kelce could very easily pop back to the very top of this list in 2022. Now, what he's been able to do throughout his career really separates him from the moniker of what a tight end is. You know, since 2017, this guy has been #3 amongst all receiving options in total receptions. That's only behind Keenan Allen and Devontae Adams since 2017, which gives you some perspective as to what kind of a receiving threat he truly is. Now, going into this upcoming season, there's the entire question as to whether or not he'll be able to sustain without a Tyreek Hill stretching the field. I personally believe, based on what we've been able to see from Travis Kelce when Tyreek Hill has not been active, that he should be able to be just fine. In the 7 games that Travis Kelce has played without Tyreek Hill in the lineup or Tyreek Hill leaving early with said injury, Travis Kelce's averaged 13.43 half PPR fantasy points per game. And without Tyreek Hill in the lineup, a guy that had career highs in terms of total targets and receptions last year, yes, you're going to bring in other talents like Juju or MVS or Sky Moore. But truly, Patrick Mahomes has already built that rapport with Travis Kelce, and perhaps his numbers continue to go up. I mean, we got to talk about this. In the last 4 seasons consecutively, since Patrick Mahomes has become the starting quarterback of the Chiefs, Travis Kelce's always had a minimum of 130 targets every year. That number could go up. He's also had 10+ touchdowns in 3 out of the last 4 seasons. And on top of it, when we're talking about just him playing and being an active part of this offense, he's never had a single game since Patrick Mahomes became the starter where Travis Kelce hasn't played more than 70% of the offensive snaps. He's going to be on the field. He's going to get those targets. He's going to be the tight end one this year. So hopefully, if you're given the opportunity, you invest in him in fantasy. All right, let's talk about Mark Andrews, the only player I wanted to talk about in this A tier. Okay, so I understand, like I mentioned a little bit ago, he did dethrone Travis Kelce, and there's a potential chance that he can once again claim the #1 tight end position. But it's just a matter of whether or not he's going to get that same opportunity that he got once Lamar Jackson left with his injury. Now, Throughout his career with Lamar Jackson, he's been fantastic. But in the 5 games that Mark Andrews played with Tyler Huntley and one with Josh Johnson last season, he was averaging 18.63 fantasy points per game. He had gone ahead and accumulated 45% of his year's fantasy points within 6 of those 17 contests. So again, there was a huge uptick in terms of targets, in terms of opportunity, and truly he was pretty much the only person catching the ball within that offense because of how much those quarterbacks continue to rely upon him every single week. Now, if in fact we get into a position where Lamar Jackson also starts to lean in that direction and we get more and more, progression in terms of opportunity for a player like Mark Andrews, of course, the sky is the limit, and I'll tell you exactly why. Over the course of the last couple of years, we have seen Mark Andrews increase his snap counts from 457 to 598, and into this last year, he played 934 total snaps, offensive snaps. I mean, that's almost double the number he had in 2019, which prior to this last year was his best season. Once he goes ahead and doubles his total snap opportunities, of course, targets are going to increase. He went ahead and increased his targets from 98, 88 to 153 this last season, an insane number. And obviously, we want to continue to see those touchdowns rise. But at this current moment in time, as long as they stay stable, we're going to be in a good spot considering he scored 10, 7, and 9 in those 3 separate years, 2019 through 2021. So as long as the progression is going in that direction, there's a lot of opportunity for Mark Andrews within this offense. I mean, when you look at 2019 through 2021, when Mark Andrews has played 70% or more percentage of the offensive snaps in a given game, in 17 contests, he was able to accomplish that. He averaged 14.81 half PPR fantasy points per game. He was able to do 12 of those 17 games just in 2021. So more progression towards staying on the field, getting more targets means more fantasy points. The only reason he's not an S tier is because I'm not sure Lamar Jackson's going to be sending him 12 targets a game for the entire season like Tyler Huntley was last year, really boosting his fantasy upside. Moving on, let's talk about Kyle Pitts, the only player in the B tier. Kyle Pitts is a special player. We know that. I mean, besides the fact that when he was drafted, he was the highest drafted NFL tight end in the history of the league. And with all the hype that surrounded what Kyle Pitts could become, he certainly did impress. I mean, in the last decade of fantasy football, he has scored the most points amongst all rookie tight ends, more than Evan Engram, more than Gronk. He put up an incredible season of 142.6 half PPR fantasy points. And though it was still underwhelming for those of us who wanted him to score more touchdowns and get more opportunity, I still think there's a lot of growth to be had from Kyle Pitts, and he's only getting better every single season. Now, last season, the Atlanta Falcons offense targeted their tight ends the 4th most amongst all teams in the league, 158 total times. Yet again, Kyle Pitts, with all the stats that he had, wasn't able to score too many touchdowns, but I'm not too worried about that because now they bring in Marcus Mariota, and though the offense may not seem as reliable as when Matt Ryan was back there throwing the rock, I'm of the opinion that Marcus Mariota, in fact, elevates the overall potential of Kyle Pitts this upcoming season. I'll tell you why. When I went ahead and looked at the 57 games that Marcus Mariota has played throughout his career where he's been healthy and good to go, he has targeted his tight ends 8.3 times per game. That has led to a 12.84 fantasy point per game average to his tight ends on a weekly basis throughout those 57 games. Now, if you go back to 2015 through 2017, the beginning of Marcus Mariota's career, while he was still the primary starter of the Tennessee Titans, Delanie Walker was his number 1 wide receiver option. Yes, he's not a wide receiver, he's a tight end, but he continued to get the ball in his direction. In fact, Delanie Walker in those years was the number 6, 5, and 4 overall tight end and was able to accumulate 346 targets, 233 receptions, 2,695 receiving yards, 16 receiving touchdowns. I mean, just incredible stats. Obviously, the touchdown numbers, we would have liked to see a little bit higher, but hey, if at least Kyle Pitts is able to get to that 5-6 range, we'll take that in comparison to what we got last season. Now, what Kyle Pitts is going to have to face this upcoming season is going to be difficult because last year in 2021, tight ends with the highest percentage of routes run primarily covered by cornerbacks, Kyle Pitts led the entire position with a 46.7% rate ahead of Mike Gesicki, Darren Waller, Travis Kelce, Tyler Higbee. Again, almost 50% of his routes he's covered by cornerbacks, which again should be relatively difficult because they're far, better coverage options than a linebacker, but he does have speed and he does have size, and those advantages could certainly get him into the correct positions to scoring more fantasy points. That's the hope this upcoming year. He's obviously going to be the primary target of this offense. As long as Mariota's throwing him the ball, we should be good to go. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the beginning of our C tier. We have George Kittle, 49ers tight end. Now listen, we know that George Kittle's been a fantastic tight end option in fantasy football. Since 2018, in the last 52 healthy games he has played, he's averaged 12.66 fantasy points per game. And though he has missed significant time in the last 3 years, he's still been able to manage. Again, he's missed 13 games in the last 3 seasons. Specifically in 2020, missed 8 games. And outside of that year, where he missed significant amounts of time, I mean, he's been the number 3 overall tight end in 2018, the number 2 in 2019, and the number 4 this last season. So he's always been a top 4 tight end. As long as he's on the field, yes, he's going to miss an occasional 1 or 2 games. Not really a big deal in the grand scheme of it when it comes to George Kittle, because he's that talented. Again, even though he is used as a primary blocker on this team, and he certainly doesn't run as many routes as a Travis Kelce, Kyle Pitts, even Mike Gesicki, George Kittle is still getting a boatload of targets going in his direction. Since 2018, the 49ers have been number 6 in the league in terms of tight end total targets. That number will continue to rise as we continue to progress towards the Trey Lance era. Now, as long as he is going to continue to be such a great blocker for this offense, he'll run less routes. But when he's given the opportunity to run routes, he's typically targeted 26 to 30% of the time on those, overall opportunities. So about 1 in 4 overall routes becomes a target for George Kittle. And the amount of yak he's been able to build up, yards after the catch within this offense, of course, he's been an incredible fantasy prospect and will continue to be. Moving on to Dalton Schultz. Listen, Dalton Schultz will have very little target competition this year, which is the reason why I think he's going to continue to maintain as one of Dak's favorite options, not even in the red zone, but throughout the entire game. With Amari Cooper, Cedric Wilson, and Blake Jarwin all gone, that opens up 182 targets in comparison to last year. And what we've seen from Dak Prescott and Dalton Schultz over the last 2 years, 2020 through 2021, in the 20 games they have played together, Dalton Schultz has averaged 10.45 fantasy points per game. Anytime he has been given 6 or more targets, he's averaged 12.41 fantasy points per game. There's only been 14 instances of 6 or more targets, 9 of those games being 10 or more fantasy points in terms of contribution. That's 65% of the time. Now, overall, when we talk about the Dallas Cowboys offense, they've continued to try to keep the tight end position as implemented as possible. Last year, we're number 10 amongst all teams in terms of tight end total targets, 131. But since 2019, they've been 13th amongst all teams in terms of total tight end targets. They want to continue to get them involved. And even last season, they at least had 1 tight end in nearly 97% of their offensive formations. So it's a given that Dalton Schultz is going to be on the field, whether he's blocking or receiving, and he's going to be a primary option because outside of CeeDee Lamb, Zeke, Pollard, Dalton Schultz is the next man up. And when we're talking about running backs, unless you're going to line up Zeke or Pollard in the slot position, Dalton Schultz will probably be there catching a boatload of passes from Dak Prescott this season. All right, moving on to Darren Waller. Now, though Darren Waller has been banged up throughout training camp, I think he's only practiced once in the last month. I really do believe he is still going to be a consistent fantasy option once he returns. Hopefully, that'll be week 1 and we won't have any issues. But, since 2019, this guy's averaged 11.97 fantasy points per game throughout 42 games, scored 14 touchdowns throughout that time, and averaged 8.33 targets per game. Now, obviously, those target counts have been without the services of a Devontae Adams in this offense, but I still think that with Josh McDaniels coming in, the tight end position is going to be a primary part, because when we look at what Josh McDaniels was able to do with Gronk from 2012 and forward, I mean, there was a lot of production to say the very least. Even last season, the tight end position for the New England Patriots was a priority. They targeted their tight ends 138 times that led to 88 receptions, 1,191 receiving yards, and 11 receiving touchdowns. That's the contributions of Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith from the New England Patriots last season when Josh McDaniels was facilitating that offense. Now, going into this upcoming year, there are going to be injury concerns because Darren Waller last season missed a lot of time with his injury. Now we're already getting some suspicion as to whether or not he'll be healthy week 1. That in itself is a little tricky. But what I do want to say is when you look at his 2020 year, the amount of success he found there and how much momentum he had going into 2021. Many of you may feel disappointed about the investment you made, but understand that from weeks 1 through 11, the first 9 games that Darren Waller played last season prior to his injury, he was the number 3 overall tight end in fantasy. And he was on an identical pace from the year prior in terms of his first 9 games. He's going to be a pivotal part of this offense. It's just a matter of whether or not he's ready to go week 1. Moving on, let's talk about Zach Ertz, the beginning of the D tier. Look, Zach Ertz moving from the Philadelphia Eagles offense to the Arizona Cardinals offense was a little bit of a shift. The fact that he has blonde hair on screen right now is just crazy to me. I couldn't even believe it when I was grabbing the images earlier today. But nonetheless, when you think about Zach Ertz, you think Philadelphia Eagles legendary tight end, a guy that finished as the number 6 3, 2, 5 overall tight end from 2016 through 2019. Obviously, in 2020, dealt with a little bit of an injury, knocked him out of the top 24 tight ends. But this last season, somehow, someway got back into the top 5 tight end conversation. Despite the fact from weeks 1 through 6 with the Philadelphia Eagles, he was only averaging 6.65 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. As soon as he joined the Arizona Cardinals, his numbers skyrocketed. From weeks 7 through 18, was averaging 9.44 fantasy points per game, and throughout that span of time was the number 4 overall tight end. Incredible numbers. Now you bring in Kyler Murray, who's going to have more of a rapport with him going into this upcoming season. When we look at the numbers that he averaged with Kyler Murray last year, 7.63 targets per game, 8.53 fantasy points per game throughout the 8 games they played together. If you go ahead and stretch that over a 17-game pace, we're getting 130 targets, 87 receptions, nearly 900 yards, 2 touchdowns, and about 145-ish half PPR fantasy points. If the Arizona offense is only going to get better with the addition of a Marquise Brown, maybe some targets are going to be allocated differently, but I still think Zach Ertz is going to be a huge part of this offense, primarily in the first 6 weeks while D-Hop is gone. He's going to be one of these pivotal pieces that helps them get through that, train of games. Moving on, we have TJ Hockenson of the Detroit Lions. Listen, TJ Hockenson, a great player. I mean, when we saw him play a full healthy season in 2020, he was the number 6 overall tight end. We've seen him have incredible success. His head coach is a former tight end in the National Football League, Dan Campbell, and he used to be a tight ends coach for the New Orleans Saints prior to getting the head coaching job with the Detroit Lions. So, all in all, they're going to continue to try to utilize the tight end position as much as they possibly can, and that's what we saw last season prior to the injury that he sustained. Now, obviously, last season when Jared Goff was under center, in comparison to some of these other backup quarterbacks, we saw TJ Hockenson play really well, averaging 10.44 fantasy points per game. In fact, in the 11 games that they played together, Goff and TJ Hockenson had 8 of those 11 games consist of 8 or more targets. Now, the total target count led to 72 targets, 54 receptions, about a 73% catch rate. Now, overall, TJ Hockenson, prior to his injury, was on a pretty good pace. He was the number 3 tight end prior to his injury between weeks 1 through 13. And if we're able to get him back at a full healthy clip, I understand there are more receiving threats in this offense with Swift, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Of course, you bring in DJ Chark. You're going to have, Jameson Williams eventually returning from the ACL, rehab. We're going to get in a position where TJ Hockenson is going to have to compete for it. But if Jared Goff is the quarterback, we know he likes to target his tight ends. We know this team has a tight end, kind of focus in mind because of the head coach and the play calling. Moving on, we have Dallas Goedert, the final player I wanted to mention in the D tier. All right, so Dallas Goedert is a pretty good tight end. We know this, right? I mean, as soon as Zach Ertz left the lineup, he developed and became a fantastic player, playing 90% of the offensive snaps in 7 of the last 10 games for the Philadelphia Eagles, averaging 10.23 fantasy points per game. And throughout that span of time, weeks 7 through 18 was the number 6 overall tight end in fantasy football. So the exit of Zach Ertz absolutely elevated the potential of one Dallas Goedert. But the issue that I have is that in the 9 games that he played with Jalen Hurts last season, he only averaged 5.88 fantasy points per game. Now, with no Ertz in the lineup and with Jalen Hurts as your quarterback, the fact that you weren't able to produce more than that is tough. But again, he didn't score any touchdowns with Jalen Hurts last season. In the best game of his season last year against the New York Jets, Gardner Minshew was the starting quarterback, mainly because Jalen Hurts was out with an injury. So maybe there was a chance that with Jalen Hurts, he was able to still put up 24 plus fantasy points and have an incredible week. But when I went ahead and did a little bit more digging and looked at the amount of red zone targets he was given, he had an ample amount in comparison to all tight ends in the league. So I went even further. I went straight to the tape. I wanted to go see every single red zone opportunity that Dallas Goedert had last season. There were about 4 times he could have scored a touchdown, that he was tackled down on the 5-yard line or was called back because of an holding that really didn't even need to be held because the quarterback was clean to go and getting the ball out of his hands. There were so many instances of those scenarios that if you go ahead and slap on, 3 or 4 extra touchdowns to Dallas Goedert's, overall potential production last season, he's in that top 5 conversation. So I think Dallas Goedert, as long as they're trending in the right direction, we have Jalen Hurts more comfortable in this offense, getting more receiving threats, which will spread out defenses. I think he should be in a great spot, but he just has to find the end zone. The tight end position certainly needs that in order to be relevant. All right, let's go ahead and start out with Dawson Knox here. Prior to this last season, he was a nobody. The Bills never used tight ends in their offensive formations, rarely passed them the ball, but man, did he elevate his game. Last season, if he had never gotten injured, if he had not broken his hand, he was on pace to being the number 5 overall tight end in fantasy with the potential of scoring over 10 touchdowns. Would have been the only tight end to accomplish that last season, which again is a pretty huge feat, especially considering how important touchdowns are to the tight end position. That being said, Dawson Knox is just one of 6 tight ends to complete and finish a top 12 rank while only getting less than 72 targets since 2010. Now, as of the last 5 years, he's joining the company of a Robert Tonyan, Jonnu Smith, Jared Cook, Evan Engram, Rob Gronkowski, players that, yes, did find production, did get a low amount of targets, but were able to at least get those touchdowns. But in those following years, the tight ends didn't really find much success. And that's what gives me concern. When you look at his overall production last season, Dawson Knox had 49 receptions and 9 receiving touchdowns. That means 1 out of every 5.4 catches, he was catching a touchdown. Now, yes, there's no Cole Beasley, there's no Emmanuel Sanders, but can we continue to see that level of red zone opportunity be there for Dawson Knox and obviously elevate his game because he's scoring 7 to 9 touchdowns in a given year? I'm hoping that's going to be the case. Obviously, last season when he's having games where he's catching the ball 3 times for 40 yards and then a random touchdowns in there, he's saving your week with a 10-point performance. But if he's not catching those touchdowns, he's certainly a liability on your roster, which makes him a little bit of a riskier play. But we're purely hoping that Josh Allen is able to elevate all the pieces around him and keep him as a great fantasy option. Moving on to David Njoku. Now, in my opinion, if I'm not able to get one of my top 6 tight ends, the guys between S and C tier, I'm typically going after David Njoku, and I'll tell you why. I think he's one of the best late round targets that you may even be able to get farther down than where I have him ranked. He's a player that at his current ADP is kind of being slept on, despite how much opportunity he's going to have on his hands. From 2020 through 2021, the Cleveland Browns have targeted their tight ends the 8th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League, 281 times in the last 2 seasons. Again, averaging about 140 targets per season. Last season, the total tight end contribution from the Cleveland Browns consisted of 142 targets, 95 receptions, 1,053 receiving yards, 10 receiving touchdowns, and nearly 215 half PPR fantasy points. If that level of opportunity is available for David Njoku this upcoming season, imagine what we're going to potentially see here. Now you bring in Jacoby Brissett. He's going to be the starting quarterback for the first 11 games. When you looked at Jacoby Brissett's work since 2017 with tight ends, the per game opportunity with Jacoby Brissett with his tight ends, 9.33 targets per game that have led to 10.78 fantasy points per game. Okay, let's talk about Deshaun Watson and his tight ends. In the final 2 years at Houston, Watson targeted his tight ends on average 103 times per year that led to 168.7 fantasy points per season. Again, the averages are going to continue to be there. You no longer have Austin Hooper, who was the primary receiving threat in terms of tight ends in this offense. Yes, you have Harrison Bryant, but he's still an inexperienced player, and David Njoku is going to be the field-stretching tight end that is only going to continue to make plays every single week within a Cleveland Browns offense that may have to throw a lot and doesn't have many weapons outside of Amari Cooper and himself. Moving on. Pat Freiermuth had a great season last year. In fact, he's the 4th best rookie tight end performance of the last decade, only behind Kyle Pitts, Evan Engram, and Rob Gronkowski. The fact that he was able to find so much success out of absolutely nowhere was incredible. Now, obviously, last season, he had to beat out Eric Ebron. Him doing so was incredible. But as soon as we got him into a position where he was with Ben Roethlisberger, he was putting up consistent numbers. And the main reason why is because Big Ben Roethlisberger could not throw the ball down the field. You know, the overall ADOT, the average depth of target for Pat Freiermuth last season was 5.9 yards. Relatively close to the line of scrimmage because that's exactly where Big Ben wanted to throw the ball. Relatively close, get the ball out of his hands, protect himself. Now, we may not see that out of Mitchell Trubisky this upcoming season, but I'm thinking we may be seeing at least decent numbers in 2020 when Mitchell Trubisky was a starting quarterback and participated in those games. In the 8.5 games he played, he targeted the tight end position 69 total times for 45 catches, 392 yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, 95.4 fantasy points. That's 11.22 fantasy points per game to his respective tight ends when he was with the Chicago Bears in 2020. I think Pat Freiermuth is certainly going to continue to be a part of this offense. They used 11 personnel, 1 tight end, 1 running back, the second most times amongst all teams in the National Football League last year. So Pat Freiermuth is certainly going to be on the field and be a main priority for this offense. Moving on to the F tier, we begin with Cole Kmet. Now, Cole Kmet's certainly rising on our boards. In comparison to last year, he was relatively low because they still had Jimmy Graham, but now you have no more Jimmy Graham, and quite frankly, they don't have a lot of other options within this offense, and that continues to open up more target opportunity for Cole Kmet. Now, last season, He was number 8 in terms of total tight end targets in the National Football League, obviously with the contributions of Nick Foles, Andy Dalton, and Justin Fields. Yet he didn't score a single touchdown in 2021. That's relatively rare, considering that's the first time we've seen a tight end do that since Jared Cook in 2015, where he had 75 targets and no touchdowns. Now, when I think of the potential of a Cole Kmet this upcoming season, the primary thought is, can Justin Fields get him the ball? From week 6 through 15, in the 7 games that they played together, Cole Kmet was targeted 5.86 times per game, 4 receptions, 6.33 fantasy points per game. Not the most, upside numbers, but it looks kind of like what Dallas Goedert was dealing with last year. And if we attribute a couple touchdowns in the direction of a Cole Kmet, maybe, just maybe, his overall production increases. Now, when you look at this team last season, the Chicago Bears targeted their tight ends the 6th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League in the red zone. 22 targets that only led to 4 receiving touchdowns. A lot of those taken by, of course, Jimmy Graham. But if we go ahead, we eliminate those opportunities to Jimmy Graham and elevate those numbers in the direction of Cole Kmet, he could very easily be in this top 12 to 13 conversation this upcoming season. Moving on to Hunter Henry. Speaking of scoring touchdowns, this is another one of these tight ends that benefited from the fact that his quarterback wanted to, without a doubt, make him the primary red zone option. In the last couple years, Hunter Henry, even prior to getting to the New England Patriots, was a consistent tight end in fantasy football, finishing as the number 9 and 13 tight end prior to joining this team when he was with the Los Angeles Chargers. And then, of course, this last season becoming the 9 overall tight end because of the 9 receiving touchdowns he had last season on only 50 receptions. This is kind of a similar conversation to Dawson Knox. Can we anticipate Mac Jones throwing as many touchdowns in his direction, getting 17 red zone targets, leading to 8 receiving touchdowns, 9 targets from within the 5-yard line, leading to 5 receiving touchdowns? If those numbers are not going to be there for the 2022 New England Patriots, then we're going to be in a little bit of trouble with his overall value because the receiving yards are certainly not there, and Jonnu Smith is beginning to build momentum in training camp. That being said, I still think Hunter Henry is going to be the primary receiving threat down in the red zone, which is going to make him a relevant option in maybe, 6, 7 out of the 16 weeks that we eligibly can play him. It's a matter of matchups and whether or not he's scoring as to whether or not he's going to be, a startable option in a given week. Otherwise, I'm not okay with getting 3 catches for 33 yards from a player like Hunter Henry unless he's scoring a touchdown. Moving on, let's talk about the G tier, beginning with Irv Smith, one of the tight ends that, again, did not play last year and has a lot of momentum going into this upcoming season. In 2021, we saw Tyler Conklin take his place when Irv Smith went down with an injury. Last season, Tyler Conklin consisted of 87 targets and 107.8 half PPR fantasy points. Now you bring in Kevin O'Connell, former offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams. The Rams last season used 11 personnel, 1 tight end, 1 running back, 895 times. Again, that's most amongst all teams in the National Football League in terms of that, personnel formation, which was ahead of the Pittsburgh Steelers, ahead of the Buffalo Bills, and Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, going into 2022, when I look at Irv Smith, I purely think he's just going to be the Tyler Higbee of this offense. Tyler Higbee last season, about 116.5 half PPR fantasy points in 15 games, 61 receptions, 500 yards, 5 touchdowns. I think those numbers are very easily attainable. And when you think of the fact that the offensive coordinator of the Minnesota Vikings is Wes Phillips, he used to be the former tight ends coach for the Los Angeles Rams and passing game coordinator, they're going to try to get, the ball into the direction of Irv Smith. He is a very talented young tight end. He's just got to stay healthy and on the field, and we're going to be in a great position for him to potentially get into that top 12 conversation, barely if those touchdown numbers are up there. But it's going to be difficult to compete with the amount of opportunity going towards Jefferson, Cook, Thielen, Osborne. Moving on. Let's talk about Tyler Higbee, his immediate comparison. Tyler Higbee, I think he's probably going to have very similar numbers in comparison to what we saw last season. He was the number 14th ranked tight end in 2021, was able to play 90% of the offensive snaps in 11 of his 15 games, but was only able to surpass 10 or more fantasy points twice last season in a half PPR scoring format. Obviously, that mainly had to do with the fact that Cooper Kupp is dominating down in the red zone, along with guys like Robert Woods, OBJ last season, the running backs, being primary values there. Tyler Higbee is kind of an afterthought, and he's used as one as well. That's why I'm not so excited about his overall upside to be, as a higher tier player. Because, again, when you look at what the Rams have done and what Sean McVay has done with his tight ends, he has primarily used them to pull attention from cornerbacks because he always wants to give Cooper Kupp opportunities against linebackers. Last season, tight ends who had the highest percentage of their routes ran against cornerbacks. We talked about it earlier. Kyle Pitts led that category, followed by Gesicki, Darren Waller, Travis Kelce, but 5th on that list, 37.3% of the time. Nearly 40% of his routes being ran against cornerbacks. That'd be Tyler Higbee. It's going to be pretty tough for him. But as of right now, again, he's kind of in the middle of the pack tight end. You could pick him up, have him as your tight end too, maybe play him in a good matchup. But outside of that, it's kind of a relatively risky play on a weekly basis. Moving on to Mike Gesicki. Speaking of risky, my goodness, this is going to be a interesting one. Though Mike Gesicki has finished as the number 11, 7, and 11 overall tight end in the last 3 consecutive years, a top 12 at the position, he's most likely not going to be utilized in the same capacity. Over the last couple seasons, I mean, he's just primarily been a wide receiver. He's one of only 8 tight ends that have ran 75% of their routes from the slot or out wide. I mean, he ranked, number 1 in that category. He ran 92% of his overall snaps from the slot or out wide last season. That number is insane. And when you try to fill him into the mold in which, Mike McDaniel might want to, playing him in the inline, making him a George Kittle, again, Mike Gesicki is not a blocking threat. He is purely just a receiving threat. And when you think of his potential receiving upside, it's not relatively high. When we look at the last 3 seasons of what Mike Gesicki has put forth, his overall production hasn't been great. I mean, overall, he has only had 2 games of over 10 or more fantasy points when he hasn't scored a touchdown. He's only scored, 13 touchdowns in his career, which is a little bit concerning. If you're only able to get over that, hump when you're scoring touchdowns and you're extremely reliable of those things, and Tua doesn't really like to target you very much when you get down into the red zone, the numbers aren't going to be stacking up very high this year, but I'm hoping it does. Hopefully I'm wrong. Moving on to the final tight end of the G tier. Let's bring up Noah Fant. I think Noah Fant is extremely underrated. And I understand that you may think, he's going to the Seattle Seahawks. He's going to be the number 3 receiving option. You could still be a number 3 receiving option on a team and still be relevant. Again, all it takes is touchdowns and opportunity. In the last couple years, he's finished as number 16, 12, and 12 overall tight end in fantasy football while having Drew Lock, Teddy Bridgewater, Rippon, Driscoll, Flacco, Allen, and even Hinton. If you guys remember the wide receiver that started against the Saints a couple years ago for the Denver Broncos because all their quarterbacks were out that given week. We've seen a lot of production, but let's say, for example, Drew Lock becomes the starting quarterback of this team. If you go ahead and look at what Drew Lock has done in the first 17 starts of his career, we have seen Drew Lock target the tight end position 95 times, which has led to 141.4 fantasy points. So maybe, just maybe, we may be in a position here where Noah Fant could absorb some of that overall value. When you look at Lock's positional distribution of targets, 55.6% to wide receivers, 15.1% to running backs, and 26.1% to the tight end position. Again, that's a lot of targets going in the direction of tight ends, which is something that he's preferred. And though the offensive coordinator for the Seattle Seahawks isn't building an offense to funnel targets in the direction of a tight end, we may still be in a position where Drew Lock is going to send the ball towards the receiver that he has the most rapport with, which is going to be Noah Fant, considering they were both from the Broncos and traded to the Seahawks. Now, let me throw out an extra argument. If in fact we get to a position where my suspicions and the rumors that I've heard are true, and Jimmy Garoppolo gets cut within the next week, and he is signed to the Seattle Seahawks, imagine what he'll be able to do with tight ends. Again, let's not forget how much he has utilized George Kittle over the last couple of years. Obviously, the offense has been, formulated around that, but maybe, just maybe, Noah Fant gets a little bit of a boost with that as well. All right, moving on. Albert Okwuegbunam, the guy that is supposed to benefit the most from Noah Fant's departure from the Denver Broncos. Albert Okwuegbunam is kind of in a tricky situation. I don't know. I'm thinking to myself, what is he going to be able to do with Russell Wilson when Russell's always trying to funnel target his primary 2 receiving threats, which are wide receivers predominantly? Now, when you go back to 2015 through 2017, the tight end position was certainly used by Russell Wilson down in the red zone. Jimmy Graham was the number 2 receiving option outside of Doug Baldwin throughout that span of time. So certainly Albert Okwuegbunam may be able to turn into a receiving threat in the red zone. But again, when I'm hearing a lot about him splitting snaps, splitting reps with Greg Dulcich, the rookie tight end out of UCLA, when I hear Nathaniel Hackett come out and say, when you have a guy that can stretch the field, it's extremely exciting. We're going to get him incorporated in this offense. I'm thinking they're going to split the tight end position up. They're going to use a lot of 12 personnel where they're using both tight ends. And I don't think Albert Okwuegbunam is going to have as much opportunity as others think. Moving on to our next tight end, we have Gerald Everett. Now, Gerald Everett is going to the Los Angeles Chargers this season. I almost said Rams. He used to be on the Rams. In fact, this is his 3rd team in the last 3 years. He went from the Rams to the Seahawks, and now he's a Charger. Interestingly enough, I think there's a lot of opportunity in this Chargers offense for a tight end to find, top 18, 17 value at the position. Last season, the Chargers targeted their tight ends the 9th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League. 137 targets that led to 195.4 half PPR fantasy points. And though Jared Cook was the primary tight end in this offense, he squandered a lot of his opportunities, only having a 57.8% catching rate last season. 83 targets that led to 48 receptions, 564 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, almost identical numbers to what a Tyler Higbee could put up. So if Gerald Everett is just able to catch the ball at a far more consistent rate, you no longer have Jared Cook in this lineup, Steven Anderson. I know Donald Parham is going to be a red zone threat, but maybe, just maybe, Gerald Everett could be a pretty good option for Justin Herbert this year. Moving on to Evan Engram. Evan Engram is brought up mainly purely off of his prior success and what Doug Peterson has done with tight ends. Obviously, Evan Engram, his rookie year, when he had made that performance, 141.6 fantasy points? That was the best rookie tight end performance we had seen in the last, decade, all time. Great numbers, better than Gronk, all those kind of things, which was exciting. And then since then, he has just completely begun to just fall apart every year, get injured, drop passes, all of that above. But now he gets a restart. He gets to join Doug Peterson. Doug Peterson from 2016 through 2020. As the head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles, targeted his tight ends the most amongst all teams throughout that span of time. 994 times throughout those 5 seasons. And that was 182 targets more than the next best team, which was the Chiefs, throughout that span. Now, most recently, what we've seen from Doug Peterson is a lot of success from tight ends. You go back to 2019. Both Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz were both top 10 tight ends in that given year. And even when we go back to 2020, the final year with the Philadelphia Eagles, he used tight ends within his offensive formations 97.78% of the time, and had used 2 tight ends 19.73% of the time. In my opinion, Evan Engram is going to be on the field. This is a tight end that ran a 4.4 40. Again, when you're running sub 4.5, you're a fast son of a gun, and you're going to be on the field as a threat that is going to stretch the field. It's just a matter of whether or not Trevor Lawrence is going to throw him the ball and whether he's going to be able to catch those passes. But as of right now, I see him as an option because Doug Peterson loves to use the tight end position and made it a point to go out this offseason and bring him in as that primary threat in this offense. Moving on to Austin Hooper. He's going to be joining the Tennessee Titans. Interestingly enough, he signed a pretty massive contract with the Cleveland Browns, and they were like, you know what, we're going to move on from you because truly they don't really need him, and they've gone ahead and hit David Njoku with the franchise tag. But the potential in which Austin Hooper has shown in the past, 2018 and 2019, being the consecutive back-to-back number 6 overall tight end in fantasy football, does give me some hope. But, I had a lot of hope about the tight end position last year once Jonnu Smith had left the Tennessee Titans. I had a lot of expectations for Anthony Firkser to come out and be a great tight end, and I advertised him as such last season, yet he only showed up and put up 62.1 fantasy points in a committee tight end situation. Ryan Tannehill went from targeting his tight ends 29% of the time to 20% of the time within a singular year. If Austin Hooper is joining this team to be a part of this committee tight end situation, we don't want any piece of it. But if he's going to be the primary tight end target, then we've seen from seasons past that could be a lot of value in the Titans offense. Moving on to Hayden Hurst. Hayden Hurst is going to fill into the shoes of CJ Uzomah, who went to the Jets this offseason. Hayden Hurst, he himself, is moving to his 3rd team in 4 years, going from Baltimore to Atlanta to Cincinnati. Now, again, we've seen Hayden Hurst, when he was with the Atlanta Falcons, be a great option. In 2020, he was the number 9 overall tight end in fantasy football. 88 targets, led to 56 receptions, over 570 yards, 6 catches, 121 fantasy points. Great numbers. Now, when you look at what the Cincinnati Bengals gave their tight ends in terms of total opportunity, 83 targets, led to 63 receptions, 590 yards, 5 touchdowns, 120 fantasy points. If we're able to see Hayden Hurst absorb all of the tight end opportunity of the Cincinnati Bengals, a team that used at least one tight end in 93% of their plays last season, maybe, just maybe, Hayden Hurst can get into that conversation once again. He's talented enough. He's going to be a blocking threat on this field. And while defenses are worried about Chase Higgins, Boyd Mixon, maybe down the seam, Hayden Hurst is catching touchdowns from Joe Burrow. Moving on, Robert Tonyan. He's coming off of an ACL injury. Hopefully he'll be ready to go because, honestly, he may be asked to be the red zone receiving threat of this offense. You go back to 2020. He was the number 3 tight end in the league because he scored 10 touchdowns in that given season with 50 receptions. And yes, that is not a sustainable number, but again, when you think about Devontae Adams no longer being in this lineup, maybe Robert Tonyan is going to get back into that role. Now, when I went ahead and looked at how many points tight ends have scored when Davante Adams hasn't been in the lineup since 2019, in the 8 games where Adams was not there or left early with an injury, tight ends were targeted 6.6 times per game, led to 5.5 receptions, 68 yards, 0.88 receiving touchdowns per game, 14.61 fantasy points per game average without Adams in the lineup. I think there's a lot of potential here for Robert Tonyan, if healthy and ready to go, and Josiah DeGuara, the backup tight end, isn't taking too much work to being a decent tight end. It's, again, reliant on touchdowns. Moving on to Kyle Rudolph. The reason why I wanted to mention him here, despite the fact that he's out of my technical top 24, is because there's potential. The Bucs targeted their tight ends in the red zone the most amongst all teams last year. 33 targets that led to 9 receiving touchdowns. Again, if you're going to see Cameron Brate take the backseat to Kyle Rudolph, I understand that there is still Fournette, Evans, Julio, and Godwin as primary red zone threats. But maybe if teams are just distracted with them, Kyle Rudolph could have a sneaky year with like 8 touchdowns on 40 grabs. You never know. It's always a possibility. The final player I wanted to mention is Isaiah Likely, the rookie out of Coastal Carolina. In his final year at college, 77 targets, 59 receptions, 912 receiving yards, 12 receiving touchdowns. He played 73% of his offensive snaps from the end line and had the 9th most missed tackles forced last season amongst all tight ends in the NCAA, 5th most deep target receptions. He's a field stretcher, and what we've seen from this preseason, 12 targets, 12 catches, 144 yards, 1 receiving touchdown, 26.4 fantasy points. Dude, he's been great. If teams start to focus heavily on stopping Mark Andrews, maybe, just maybe, Isaiah Likely steps up as another one of those receiving threats in this offense, because outside of Rashad Bateman, I don't really trust Devin Duvernay or James Prochet to be receiving threats on a consistent basis. The backfield doesn't catch too many passes, so why not Isaiah Likely? All right, that will cover today's tight end tier list video. Again, be sure to subscribe if you like today's content. I greatly appreciate that, helping us crush our goal of 60,000 subscribers. Again, if you guys want to go ahead and join the giveaway before tomorrow night's live stream at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on the channel, again, you have to use promo code Andrew, make a first-time deposit. You will not only get a deposit match up to $100. So again, if you deposit 20, you'll get 20. You'll also get my rankings for a half and full PPR for this upcoming draft season. And of course, you'll be entered to win. 10 of you will win $50 of in-game underdog currency, which you can use to draft and gain some experience off-season prior to your league's drafting this upcoming week. Thank you everybody for watching, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.